don't be afraid to comment and ask questions. We're always looking for new directions, new potential flaws. That's how we learn and grow. There's nothing wrong with finding fault with our own work and exploring what that means. And in my experience, that always leads to better results, actually, when someone finds some kind of issue with what you've done. You actually end up improving things and exploring new questions. So this talk is divided into two. The first half is primarily philosophy, where we're ourselves looking critically at definitions of things used in the field in the past, and asking whether those definitions are still serving us and whether more recent discoveries perhaps render those definitions less relevant or less useful. And in general, definitions and standards that we have should be sort of co-evolving with our discoveries. So these kinds of questions of what is life, for example, is a constantly evolving question and answer or set of answers. So in some ways, the job is never done, and that's okay. That's how science is supposed to work. So that will be the first half, and then the second half will be a little bit more concrete, in the sense that I will present our most recent results in trying to model systems relevant to the origins of life, and also trying to analyze exoplanet signals in the context of detecting life as we don't know it. So there is a underlying angle of trying to think about life as we don't know it here. So personally, my focus has not been on the exact conditions of life's emergence on Earth. And in the context of biosignatures, in general, I'm not looking for exact signatures of exactly the type of life that we see on Earth. My own personal interest is in alternative forms of life and more general sort of signatures and systems. But all the different ways of exploring these questions are equally valid. There's no, we're all of us in the field make up this sort of tapestry of different approaches. And so there's no such thing as a right or wrong way of doing astrobiology. We're all just exploring different ways of viewing these questions. And the strength of the field comes from the combination of all those different perspectives, as opposed to a consensus. And I don't expect there to be a consensus for many years, which is good because it makes things interesting. So let's start off with our sort of philosophical discussion. And like I said, this will revolve around how we think about life and how we try to define life, and how those definitions can serve us, help guide our observations and experiments and so forth. And the second part will look at habitability and a new definition or replacement for the concept of habitability that we published recently. So the citations for this work are just here on the bottom right corner. Our definition of life, or Lyfe as we pronounce it, was published a few years ago. And then our new framework for habitability, which was first authored by Michael Wong, who graduated from our group several years ago. That paper was published this year. And of course, there was also great contributions from Siha, who is in our group graduating in 1 or 2 years' time, I guess, and Lulu Tiani, who's actually a high school student. So still hasn't started her undergraduate education. She's already making significant contributions to this frontier astrobiology. So an amazing achievement for these great young talents. So I want to thank them for their contributions. So the question that is underlying these kinds of discussions and thinking is what we can say for sure about life in the universe and what we can't. So some of the assumptions that you will find in astrobiology, for example, relate to molecules that we are familiar with in life as we see it today, or some simplified version of life as we see it today. So there's a strong assumption underlying a lot of astrobiology research, which is that to that the origin of life must involve known biomolecules, for example, amino acids, nucleic acids, lipids, and sugars. And we've seen that in the book and in all kinds of papers. And there is a very challenging question there, because obviously at some point in life's history, it was comprised of amino acids, nucleic acids, lipids, and sugars. But the question is, at what point did those molecules become involved? Is it possible that the origins of life actually involve different molecules? And those particular molecules that we see now are the end result of some potentially long period of optimization. And so it's possible, again, no one knows, but it's possible that the origins of life, the event or the series of events, the sequence of events related to the origins of life might have been somewhat disconnected from the amino acids, nucleic acids, etc., that we're familiar with. It actually might have involved other molecules. And this is sort of part of the reason we might think that is the case, is because life's history is full of strange twists and turns and repurposing of different things for new functions. And so if the history of life teaches us anything, it's that it's very difficult to retrodict backwards what would have come before. Or rather, if you're at a given position in life's history, predicting where it's going to go into the future is often extremely difficult, because random events will sort of come in and render, let's say, one trait non-functional or another trait functional for a different purpose in a new environment. And it's a bit of a sort of historical science in some ways, and science struggles with historical processes. There's other assumptions related to the role of Darwinism. So the assumption could be expressed as origins of life researchers assume that if their system exhibits Darwinism, then the complexity that we associate with life, or the increase in biological complexity that we see in the biological world, is going to follow as a natural consequence. But this hinges on whether Darwinism is a very sophisticated optimization algorithm, in which case it can improve an existing set of things, but might struggle to discover and explore new spaces, or whether in fact Darwinism is sufficient to not only optimize existing functional units, but to discover and incorporate new things into the evolving system. And there's other assumptions, such as what you might call the kind of engineering assumption. So because we know the end result of the events related to the origins of life, we know that it ended, or not ended, but it resulted in the first sort of integrated cellular system. There's a temptation to go from our prebiotic systems and imagine a sequence that's going almost in the shortest path from some geochemical scenario to this cellular system that we recognize. But those systems, whatever system it was that gave rise to life, it didn't have any kind of goal. It was not trying to create life from non-life. And so it's entirely possible that the path from non-life to life was not a sort of shortest path straight line, but rather this more zigzaggy, sort of hard to predict trajectory of serendipity, you might call it. And again, if that was true, that makes the origins of life a more difficult scientific problem. But we just have to bear in mind that all of these things are possible, and that the origins of life was not like putting together a car where you gradually assemble one part after another and sort of put them together, and then at the end of the production line you have the right thing. I think we could all agree that it was somewhat different. So we should try and let the systems tell us how this process unfolded, as opposed to strongly trying to project our own preconceptions. But having said that, we have to have some preconceptions, otherwise we're kind of lost. And I have my own preconceptions. We all have our own preconceptions about how life began. So I think it's just a matter of sort of keeping an open mind and not not being too strong on things which are unconstrained, I think, is the key. So in order to loosen our constraints on what we're looking for, both in the origins of life and when we look for life outside of the solar system, some years ago, 2 years ago, in fact, Dr. Michael Wong and myself introduced a new definition for life, which we call Lyfe. As you can see there, it's spelled with a Y and it's pronounced Lyfe instead of life. We've received all kinds of feedback about the pronunciation and about the etymology and so forth. But I'm not going to go through any of the criticism. I'll just say that if you have something better, then please let me know. I've been saying this for the last 2 years, and so far no one has given me a better option, but we're perfectly open to superior alternatives should they come along. But what Lyfe actually means is that it's the entire set of all living things throughout the universe, no matter where they are. And it includes life with an I, but life with an I is the specific subset of Lyfe, which we find here on Earth with the particular molecular components that we see here on Earth. And I'll talk about this in more detail later, but that's the rough picture. So you might say, why do we need another definition of life? There's already several out there, and it's a bit of a thorny philosophical issue. And I would say the main reason is that science moves very quickly, and especially fields like molecular biology, synthetic biology, machine learning, etc. And I would say that our improved understanding of life in the context of improved thinking and improved observations basically could compel us to think of alternatives to the original definitions, more inclusive definitions, and definitions which are not derived from this sort of like narrower observational base that we had in the past. So we're basically trying to incorporate the conclusions and ideas that have come from some of the most recent and most influential research to update our thinking about what it means to be alive versus not alive. And in particular, we were concerned that past definitions of life might actually be misleading us and might be sort of limiting our scope when we're thinking about origins of life and life in the universe. So, for example, the main working definition that a lot of people use is this NASA definition of life: self-sustaining chemical system capable of Darwinian evolution, which we think might be potentially misleading because no living system is truly self-sustaining. This is a bit of a tricky sort of phrase, self-sustaining, because every living system is relying on some external supply of energy or material or information. Chemical system seems a bit strange because life is not just chemistry, it's physics, it's learning, it's computation, it's many things. So it's strange why this emphasis on chemical. And then Darwinian evolution. So Darwinian evolution is a very powerful learning process, optimization process. But given what we now understand about for example, epigenetic information processing and protein-based learning systems, it's entirely possible that life is using a combination of Darwinian evolution and all these other learning processes together in order to sort of optimize its function. And given that new understanding of different types of learning processes, we probably need to broaden our thinking beyond just Darwinian evolution as ways that life sort of optimizes itself. So, so in general, in the past, we were just focused on finding life exactly as we know it, very, very similar, life 2.0, you might call it, which is a little bit like trying to aim for the bullseye on a dartboard. And when you're playing darts, you don't actually aim for the bullseye in general. Firstly, because it's difficult to hit, it's only a tiny area in the center, and it's not actually the highest scoring region on the board. And there are other high scoring regions that should also be considered. So we sort of feel like right now we're sort of aiming at the bullseye, even though there's this whole other board that we could be aiming for. So this is motivated by the fact that life as we know it could be very rare, but there could be this more general class of phenomena with lifelike characteristics out there. And science is preceded by these types of sort of broadening of thinking or reduction of assumptions as a way of sort of predicting and then discovering more members of a more general class of phenomena. So if we open our minds and our imaginations, there might be systems out there that we could either simulate or experimentally implement or discover that are actually more alive, let's say, than the life we see on Earth is. So, you know, there could be systems which are less alive, could also be systems which are more alive. And so the only way we're going to discover that is if we're actually looking for it. So how do we go about expanding the scope of our search? So yeah, basically there could be a sort of broader parameter space of systems that are capable of creating life, maintaining life, complexifying life, and we should try and prepare ourselves as best we can for that broader space. In general, a lot of past definitions of life were based on a framework a little bit like this, which we called, or some people refer to as, the privileged functions. So it often is this sort of three tripartite system where you have like the information module, which is basically storing the sort of sequence instructions for assembling all the components of the living system. And there's the metabolic module, which is basically converting precursor material and free energy into all of the components of the living system. And then there's the compartment, which is the sort of boundary of the system. So this is similar to, or this is inspired by the autopoiesis concept due to Maturana and Varela, but it's also similar to the sort of chemoton framework introduced by Tibor Ganti. So under this like definition of life, you assume you need all these three to comprise the living system. And so origins researchers are sometimes seeking all of these three processes in their experiments or their simulations. But often it's tempting to seek the emergence of one of these subsystems, because getting them all, observing them all in one system is very challenging and hasn't been really achieved yet. And so it's sort of tempting to try and break this problem up and think about one emerging after the other, which leads to these so-called X first theories, like information first, metabolism first, etc. And then, you know, different environments are better for one or the other. But again, this is one way of looking at life, but it's not the only way. And whether it's right to think about things sequentially is also another question. So that it's possible that everything came all at once, or nothing came all at once, and the things which emerged first somehow morphed into what we recognize as biological functions later on. And so we basically feel that even this description, which is fairly general, is potentially not general enough. For example, maybe it's possible for there to be life in the absence of compartments. Maybe you could have life in bulk phase, essentially, without like bounded individuals. Even though it's difficult, even when you assume bounded individuals, it's difficult to really objectively tell the difference between inside and outside. It's fairly easy if you've got a well-defined membrane, but it can be tricky in some cases. And maybe replication is not strictly necessary. Maybe there's forms of life out there which don't use replication and evolution as a way of accumulating information about their environments. They just learn by some other means. So for those reasons, we feel like it's possible there could be life out there that, for example, is not compartmentalized, doesn't replicate. How do we generalize beyond that? And then finally, there are many different ways of exploring the origins of life question, and different people are exploring different questions within the origins of life problem. So some people are looking for historical explanations. For example, these like we assume there's maybe this purple line. If we're going through state space here, gradually evolving towards the living state. Maybe there's this one particular path that Earth took, and some people really want to understand the details of that path, which is one of many valid ways of looking at this. There could be other paths that alien life took, but we're assuming that this bottleneck here basically represents that there do exist some constraints on what it means to be living, and so that's what sort of defines this bunching together here. And then there's universal explanations, which would be exploring exactly what those constraints are. So what does it mean for these trajectories to sort of bundle here? What is it about the state of the living systems that actually make them living? And then there's synthetic explanations where you're just trying to make life from scratch. And so you might not be concerned with the historical details, but you just want to explore as many different ways that life can arise from non-life as possible. So yeah, we're trying to just sort of clarify these different questions so that we avoid confusion and friction and apathy. We want everyone to sort of communicate, understand each other, and all learn from each other. We don't want people to feel like they're sort of competing or they're on different, we want just a nice sort of symbiosis in the field, as it were. So that's our motivation. Now I'm going to talk about basically what we came up with to try and address these issues. So this is our definition of Lyfe, and Lyfe is defined by the simultaneous presence of four processes, four characteristics: dissipation, autocatalysis, homeostasis, and learning. And I'll just go through them one by one. They're kind of, there is some significance to the ordering, but it's not any fundamental significance. But anyway, the first one is dissipation. So we're just saying that living systems are always expected to exist out of equilibrium, because equilibrium systems don't change it over time. They don't contain free energy gradients, and so one cannot imagine any possible way that life could exist at equilibrium. And I think that would be something that everyone would agree on. Whereas, of course, non-equilibrium systems contain thermodynamic driving forces, they change over time, they have transient states, etc. So as well as existing in disequilibrium systems, under this definition, we would predict that all life in the universe, or Lyfe, in fact, has to learn how to perform what is called free energy conversion, which is basically being able to couple thermodynamically downhill processes with thermodynamically uphill processes. And you see this throughout life. So for example, we as humans might consume like reduced organic compounds. And so reacting those with oxygen is a thermodynamically downhill process, and building the components of our cells and our cells themselves is a thermodynamically uphill process. So in some ways, we are one big sort of coupling mechanism between what is dissipative and what is endergonic. Endergonic, basically a process that is working against the sort of tendency to reduce free energy, the free energy of the system. So there's a couple of examples here. For example, in a hydrothermal system, you might have a proton motive force, like a pH gradient between the inside of a hydrothermal vent and the outside. And you might be interested in an endergonic process, such as polymerizing monomers into longer molecules. And you would be looking for some kind of process or molecular component that could couple those two things together. And there are various sort of mineral complexes that have been highlighted as potential options for performing that coupling. Photosynthesis is another example where you're using the downhill process of sunlight radiating into your system and then obviously off into background space. That's a spontaneous process, and you can use that downhill process to, for example, pump protons across a membrane again. And there's all kinds of myriad examples of this coupling that we see in life. So we expect it to be common in Lyfe as well, just the identities would be different. So the second pillar is autocatalysis. This just means positive feedback under ideal conditions, or the growth of some population metric of the system, like either the population of individuals or the size of the system. So it's just to express the sort of non-linearity of the expansion of Lyfe, and that we don't expect it to be linear. But it could manifest itself in different ways. And, you know, one of the simplest examples is this is a non-living system, but obviously it's reminiscent of a living system. So just self-replication gives you autocatalysis of population size, for example. The third pillar is homeostasis, which is pretty uncontroversial. So we assume that in the context of dissipation plus autocatalysis, Lyfe will always need a way to regulate internal and external variables within ideal windows. Obviously, exponential growth without homeostasis would lead to some breakdown of a system after a while, and all of the environments that we think about for life here on Earth, and also on exoplanets for the origins of life, always involve time variability, perturbations, random events. And so without homeostasis, Lyfe would be unable to mitigate against all kinds of internal and external perturbations. So this again is a sort of regulatory process which may or may not require free energy. I mean, obviously some linearly stable systems regulate themselves without any free energy cost, but of course Lyfe in general is dissipating free energy for the sake of actively regulating whatever it needs to. And the final and perhaps the most important pillar of Lyfe is learning, which I mean, this is quite a broad category, and we're in the process of writing another paper to try and be a bit more specific about what this pillar actually means. But in general, what we mean is the ability to record information, process information, and make functional use of that information. And it comes in all kinds of different forms. Darwinian evolution is one example, but then there's a range of learning processes that we see in life, and I'm just going to go through it like a subset of them, roughly in order of possibly how they emerged in over evolutionary time. But of course, we don't know exactly. We know for the later ones, but not for the earlier ones. So our rough guess for the earliest forms of learning were probably that it was probably being carried out by molecular scale Maxwell-Demon-like devices or information engines, which are basically very small systems which are capable of essentially making simple measurements of their environment. So their actions are a function of things that they experience in their environment, and they're actually able to interconvert, for example, between information and work, or interconvert between different free energy sources. And so we sort of envisage that the most primitive, most simple information processing would have probably been carried out by some kind of emergent information engine. I mean, that's our speculation. And then, of course, at some time later, we know that life somehow discovered or evolved the ribosome, the genetic code, and the process of translation. And there has been great progress in trying to retrodict the history of the ribosome and how different subunits of, I mean, it's a RNA peptide complex, but because we understand ways in which new modules were added, there has been great progress on retrodicting the history of the ribosome. Right. And then, of course, sometime later, information processing in the biological world was happening at the scale of cells. So these are just a couple of literature examples of cell scale information processing. So sometimes it comes in the form of organisms just detecting the concentrations of ligands or chemical species in their environment and then modulating their motion through the external environment as a function of those concentrations. So there's this sort of feedback loop of making measurements and modulating your behavior and seeing whether your new behavior has improved your survival chances, has led to an increase in function or not. And you see this throughout the prokaryotic world as well as the eukaryotic world. So there are many layers of sophisticated information processing going on, even in the simplest organisms. Communication between cells, within cells, switching, decision making, etc. It's all there. And of course, along with the rise of multicellularity, which that transition may have come very early. So life may always have been, or from a very early point, been functioning as a collective. But we know, of course, that collective community scale information processing came in at some point. I mean, these examples here with termites coordinating the construction of their nest and making these very complex structures is a fairly recent example, but there's other things like slime mold. Slime mold computation has been very well studied, and in fact, there's some funny work at University of Southampton where they programmed slime molds, or they didn't program them, they integrated them into a robot and basically interfaced the robot with them so that this little community of slime mold were controlling the actions of the robot. So it was like a macro scale thing that could move around the room, but it was under the control of some slime mold. So they are very sophisticated at being sensitive to their environment and processing information. And then, of course, relatively recently in life's history, there was neural cognition, which has changed the face of the planet and been sort of a step change in the rate of learning in the biosphere. And it, of course, it's difficult to trace back the exact origins of neural cognition, but there is some evidence to suggest that it's began with sort of cytoskeletal ion transfer or electron, probably ion transfer. So probably always involved these kinds of precursors of neurons and synapses with these sort of voltage potentials and ion channels, but might have began in these kind of cytoskeletal structures at the level of individual cells. So hard to tell how old it is. Now, of course, we have this dramatic transition of planetary scale cognition, because the whole almost the entire globe is sort of interfaced with the internet now. And the internet itself, of course, is a fascinating information processing system, and we could have lengthy discussions about the function, self-awareness, etc., of the internet, because it's becoming dangerously attractive to all of us to spend the majority of our time interfacing with the internet. And we could ask whether the internet is serving us or whether we're serving the internet. And of course, access to the internet is now going into space. So beyond 5G, we're getting to the stage where everyone will be connected all the time, wherever they are. And so this is truly a global cognitive system. And sometimes we get asked, should we be afraid, etc. And one of my tentative answers to that question is basically that if the internet is either self-aware or conscious or has cynical intentions, then, and it does want to manipulate us somehow, then that is probably going to happen without our knowledge, and it's probably not going to be in the way that we expect. So I think if we are going to be afraid of some large-scale emergent property of the internet, we shouldn't get fixated on past science fiction, because it will almost certainly be something other than that. We should start thinking about alternatives, and specifically about what the objectives of such a system would be. Because out of all the possible objectives that this large cognitive system could have, killing humans is unlikely to be the first thing on its list. That's just my 2 cents worth. then, of course, beyond planetary cognition, we now have artificial intelligence, and that's a key component of the rovers that NASA has sent to Mars. They wouldn't be able to carry out a lot of their functions if they weren't at least to some extent autonomous. And of course, this was, speaking again of science fiction, this was predicted by Stanley Kubrick, in the HAL 9000, which of course famously was afraid of being switched off and took actions to prevent its human operators from turning it off, which was recapitulated by this recent news story that you probably all saw from this Google language models for dialogue applications, where the programmer of, or one of the programmers of that system, claimed that it was talking to him as if it was conscious and was afraid of being switched off. And the conventional explanation, which I think is probably right, is just that if you've trained a huge deep learning neural network on huge quantities of human written text, then it's probably going to reflect back to you not just the linguistic properties of that text, but also some higher level concepts that it extracts from that text. So, the emotions, the fears, the sort of the thinking of the people that wrote that text, not just the language. So, where learning goes from there is anyone's guess. So any system exhibiting all four of those pillars, we would call Lyfe. Then if your system has less than all four, we would call it sub-Lyfe. And part of our motivation was to try and make sense of these systems which look a little bit like life, but we know are not alive. And the question is why? Like, what is it they're lacking that they would need to have for us to think, oh, this system is fully alive? So this is basically our Venn diagram of sub-Lyfe. If you have, so here we have the four pillars. Dissipation is the big one. Autocatalysis, blue one here. Homeostasis in green, and learning in sort of pinky red. The overlap of all four, you have Lyfe. And then all these other regions represent forms of sub-Lyfe. So, for example, any irreversible thermodynamic process exhibits dissipation, but it doesn't exhibit any of the other stuff. What about, for example, something that is capable of learning and also dissipative? So a neural network would come under that heading. It's clearly a learning system and it dissipates free energy, but it's not capable of its own homeostasis because it needs all these air conditioning systems outside of it to keep it regulated. And for example, this region here, we have something that's like dissipative, homeostatic, and capable of learning. So you might think of like a thermostat would exhibit those properties. So it's regulating temperature and it's able to learn something about the behavior of the house occupants, for example. But it's not autocatalytic, at least, whether it's autocatalytic could be questioned, but I would say in and of itself, it's not autocatalytic. So hence it lies in that subregion. So then one could ask, like, if we've succeeded in broadening our thinking about life to Lyfe, does that help us imagine forms of Lyfe that we don't see here on Earth? And one of the forms of Lyfe that we wanted to suggest is what we call mechanotrophs. And mechanotroph is basically an organism which redirects external sources of mechanical energy or work into its metabolism. So although all kinds of different forms of life on Earth make use of mechanical energy, there is no example of a form of life converting mechanical energy directly into its metabolism. And so the way that we envisage this working is basically that it's the reverse of motion by the rotation of flagella. So you've probably seen, I mean, we did discuss this actually in the class. We had some examples. So you've heard about flagella motor proteins. So it's basically where the organism consumes ATP and rotates this little molecular motor. The flagellum also rotates and the microorganism gets propelled through the liquid, probably water. So what we're envisaging is basically the reverse of that. So we're imagining an organism that sort of anchored itself to a rock, for example, in a net flow field, we did some calculations on the fluid dynamics, and that we didn't find any reason why this shouldn't work. So basically the flow of this fluid would be rotating this flagellum, rotating the motor protein, which is effectively working in reverse of what a normal motor protein does, which is not a problem for those molecules, and in the process converting adenine diphosphate and a single phosphate into ATP, which it can then use for whatever it wants. And then, just in case you didn't believe me that Lyfe is out there, Lyfe is in fact out there. This was taken recently in Chicago. So the Lyfe forms are here already. In fact, they've opened a restaurant. There you see it. This was also spotted on social media, another example of Lyfe. And I just want to acknowledge the Lyfe paparazzi field operatives that took these snapshots, Harrison Smith, Richard Loeffler. Thank you very much for that. And with that, we conclude our discussion of Lyfe. And now I will just go into Genesity. So what is Genesity? Genesity, roughly speaking, is a new framework for what used to be, or what is currently called habitability. So for example, you might find in the literature something like this: the standard definition for a habitable planet is one that can sustain life for a significant period of time. As far as researchers know, this requires a planet to have liquid water. So that is a pretty strong assumption. Liquid water, I mean, it is difficult to imagine life in a non-liquid water system, but just because it's hard to imagine doesn't mean it doesn't exist. So we should probably open up to the possibility of other solvents or sort of non-water systems, because even under this definition, Enceladus and Europa would get excluded. They're not in the habitable zone, but even though they do have liquid water and they do seem habitable. So just finding this sort of ring around a host star where liquid water would exist is potentially very limiting. Lyfe doesn't fit into it, and Europa and Enceladus don't fit into it. So it's probably the time is right for an updating of habitability for these reasons. And we do think that this is sort of related to carbon chauvinism and sort of having too strong a focus on life exactly as we know it, which could be limiting as we reach out into the universe. So right now, as well as liquid water, habitability generally requires energy, and carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, sulfur, etc. So our similar approach is asking, is this too restrictive, too dependent on life as we know it? And the end result of our thinking and our discussion was that perhaps we should think of it more like this. And this is our framework for Genesity. It also has 3 components, and they are all related to one another. They influence each other and they're related. So similarly to having energy and habitability, we also agree that any what we call genial environment would need energetic driving forces, similar to how dissipation is a pillar of Lyfe. But we imagine that the energetic driving forces probably need to exist in certain windows, as in there shouldn't be too much free energy and there shouldn't be too little. A small amount of free energy is not going to be sufficient to drive life into existence or maintain it. But likewise, if a system is being bombarded with huge amounts of free energy, then it's probably going to be too chaotic to originate or maintain life. And similar to this sort of emphasis on the ChinOps elements, we want to suggest that Lyfe would just require some threshold or some window level of combinatorial diversity of components. So if your potentially genial environment only has a few components, like carbon and hydrogen, then again, that's probably insufficient for life to originate. But and we know that ChinOps seems to be a good balance here on Earth. And we could also argue that maybe a system that's overwhelmed by combinatorial diversity of components might make it more difficult for life to originate and be maintained. So we imagine there's some ideal window there. And then the main difference between our definition and previous definitions is what we call the informational driving force, which is basically that the environment in which life originates should be time varying. It should be above some threshold level of complexity, and it should be learnable. So there needs to be some learnable features, some informational complexity, so that there's some kind of driving force for the emergence of learning processes. If the environment is completely simple, then there's no advantage for information processing to emerge. And life is replete with information processing systems. So it seems to be really important. Likewise, Genesity contains this property of having informational driving forces. There needs to be something to learn about. Otherwise, you're not going to observe learning systems. Another aspect that we wanted to emphasize in this work is that along with different forms of life that could be out there, there's obviously going to be different forms of habitable or genial environments. And we can ask the question of how these two things map to one another. So in these diagrams, we've got potentially habitable environments on the bottom, and then forms of life at the top. And we basically delineate these sort of four possibilities. So maybe all the habitable environments have their relevant form of life associated with them, and it's just a one-to-one correlation. So for each habitable environment, you just have that single form of life, and you're not going to find that life in any other type of environment. Or maybe there's only one type of habitable environment, but it can give rise to different forms of life because of historical contingencies, for example. Or alternatively, there might only be one form of life. Life might be actually the only form of life, and it could be possible that multiple different environments all converge on that form of life. Or it could be many-to-many mapping. So it could be that there are lots of different habitable environments, lots of different forms of life, and each environment could, in principle, originate those different forms of life. But whether it does or it does not depends on, for example, historical factors. And so what we presented is the sort of arguably most general situation that we should think about is that if we're imagining the space of different environments here on the bottom and the space of different forms of life on the top, we could imagine that in some cases, maybe there's like a range of environments which can produce like a narrow subset of life forms. And likewise, there might be some other types of environment, like a narrow range, which for whatever reason are capable of producing quite a range of different forms of life. And so if we start with this framework, our task is basically to try and figure out all these different mappings. So if we find environments which produce different forms of life, we would want to establish why it is that happens. And likewise, if we find these broad classes of environments which sort of converge on a narrow set of life forms, we would want to understand why. In terms of how the genesity of different planets might change over time, we basically try to schematize this for a couple of different examples. So I'm going to go through now. So of course, the easiest one to start with is the one we're most familiar with, which is Earth. And so here we're basically plotting the levels of the different components of genesity as a function of time through some different sort of epochs that we went through here on Earth. So we imagine basically at the very beginning, like magma ocean kind of scenario, right at the beginning of Earth's history, the energetic driving force was probably too high. The system was way too chaotic for life to emerge at that point. And at the same time, the informational driving force was probably too low because the magma ocean environment is quite simple. And likewise, the combinatorial diversity would have been probably really low because nothing much had sort of crystallized out from the magma ocean. But then, of course, over time, as Earth cooled down and it sort of accreted various things from outside, there were more and more components available for potential origins of life events. And likewise, because things became less chaotic and there were sort of stable oscillations and predictable time variable events happening, the informational driving force would have increased. And then we imagine that, you know, at some point, origins of life happened. So this was in the ideal window for emergence. And then, of course, life evolved, and the informational driving force would have increased because as life evolved, it became more complex. There were more species, more niches created and occupied. So the IDF here is generally increasing. Combinatorial diversity of components would have been probably fairly flat, we're guessing, because it would have been the same sort of molecular, relatively similar molecular suite that came out of the origins of life, and probably stayed roughly the same, with some increases because different new enzymes and proteins and so forth were being discovered. And then, for example, when the great oxygenation event came along, the energetic driving force would have gone up and pushed things further into the ideal range for evolution. And now, of course, more recently, things are just going through the roof, basically, because we're unlocking all kinds of new sources of free energy. The number of components are going up because we're inventing all kinds of new materials and new stuff. And the informational driving force is also going through the roof because we are making measurements and generating information all over the place. So what happens now is anyone's guess. Whereas for Mars, of course, Mars may have been similar in the early stages, and there may have been origins of life events. But then, of course, later on, with the loss of the atmosphere and the sort of cooling down, it seems like the energetic driving force, informational driving force, and combinatorial diversity of components would have gone down to leaving what we see today. And for Titan, you know, it's entirely possible that there was also origins of life events as the three components got into this ideal range for emergence, and you know, maybe there's still a good level of combinatorial diversity because it's rich in all kinds of organic molecules. So the combinatorial diversity could be actually quite a good range for complexification and evolution. Whether the informational driving force is really high remains a bit of a question, because it doesn't look, you know, from just observing Titan, it's not obvious that it is inhabited. So it seems like the IDF is not super high. And again, the energetic driving force is not super high given its position in the solar system and so forth. So it'll be interesting as we understand Titan better to see where we actually stand on this graph. And for something like a hot Jupiter, maybe the energy available is just too high, and it could be that the informational driving force went too high early on and made it difficult for the emergence of life, basically. And also the combinatorial diversity is probably too low in hot Jupiters for an emergence of life event. But then we can imagine something even better than Earth, or even better for Genesity or habitability. So we can imagine the three metrics converging to the right window early on, and then things going exactly into the center of the window ideal range for evolution for a long period of time. And then maybe they go off further into the ideal range for something beyond the conventional modes of evolution that we think of. And then before I leave this section, I just want to once again acknowledge the amazing work of the people that did this. Dr. Michael Wong at Carnegie Institution, whom many of you are familiar with, Lulu Tierney, who's a high school student at the moment, destined for great things in the future, and Suha, who's with us here in the group as a graduate student. So this was great work from them. And at this point, I probably think we can take a pause. Where are we? Yeah, so let's just wonderful. So now that we've got some idea in our minds of the new concepts for life and habitability or genesity that we've thought about, the next question is, how do we go about using those frameworks to, can they guide us to new answers to the origins of life question, or can they guide us to new ways of looking for life in the universe? And I'm going to present sort of directions that we've gone in for both of those next. I'm going to talk about a way which we can think about the origins of Lyfe in an artificial system, which can potentially then be generalized to more specific systems because it's a model. And then I'm going to tell you about our new methodology for agnostic biosignatures based on complexity science. So it's going to be split into two once again. So here are the citations for these two bodies of work. The first one is coming out on September 12th, I think they said, in Physical Review E, the first half on chemical autonomous agents, and then the other study was published earlier this year in Nature Astronomy. There's the citation. So yeah, this first part is focused on the origins of life, or rather the origins of Lyfe, I should say. So this is pursuing the sort of bottom-up synthetic approach to the origins of Lyfe, where we're really interested in how the processes might emerge in a fairly abstract system that we can then map to more specific environments or exact chemical systems later on. So the main objective of this study was to understand whether you find, or how you can find systems in which learning behaviors and the learning architectures or the learning systems themselves are both emergent. Because most of the time when we think about learning and we think about neural networks or cognitive systems, the learning infrastructure or the learning architecture already exists, and then we're just interested in how the learning happens. But no one really understands what it takes for a non-living system to produce the necessary components that could exhibit learning and also do exhibit learning as well. So we want learning behaviors and learning architectures to both be emergent in the same system. We want to understand the necessary and sufficient conditions for that to happen. And so this project really combines concepts and ideas from several different areas. So we're combining the adaptive behavior of dissociative structures. So dissociative structures being spontaneous patterns that form in non-equilibrium systems and then respond in adaptive ways, functional ways. Reaction networks and autocatalysis, so the study of the relationships among different chemical compounds where there's some kind of positive feedback on subsets of the compounds in a reactive system. Learning theory and cognitive science, so we're combining ideas from associative learning and Hebbian learning and so forth, so how systems build memories of their environments and make use of those memories and that information. And then pattern formation in driven systems. So under what circumstances do you get the emergence of spatial differentiation of some physical quantities as a result of the dissipation of some external gradient in that system? So all of those fields play an important role in this work. So as I said, we're interested in how learning behaviors and learning architectures both emerge in the same system. The importance of learning, and in particular associative learning in the biosphere, is quite ubiquitous. And so I just wanted to motivate our pursuit of associative learning in non-living systems by this very simple example where we have a gazelle living out on the plains, and obviously it wants to avoid getting attacked by a leopard like this. And so very quickly, animals like this would learn to associate the sight of a leopard on a tree, for example, with a time-associated event like this, being attacked. So very quickly they would learn, seeing the leopard here might be followed sometime quite soon later by an attack. And so this allows it to take advantage of a preemptive response that would protect it. So it knows if I see the leopard, then I should run away because I've seen this happen before and I've associated these two things. So I should run away when I see the leopard, and that will protect me. Whereas when I don't see the leopard, I can relax and do other things. And there's different levels to this. So there's the level of just associating, for example, visual images with a particular event, which is to be avoided. And it's avoided by taking preemptive actions in due time before the dangerous event happens. But then there's also a level of associating like the likelihood of these two things as a function of environment, because there might be some environments where even seeing the leopard is not a good predictor that there's going to be an attack. Maybe the landscape is very poor for the leopard trying to attack the animal. And so actually seeing it is not a good predictor that there's going to be an attack. Whereas in other environments, maybe if the animal is particularly exposed, this correlation might get stronger. So there's the association of the danger with seeing the predator, and then there's the strength of the association between the predator attacking and the nature of the environment. So associative learning comes in lots of different forms and could be used to preemptively avoid danger, or it could be used to preemptively take advantage of opportunities. But this basic sort of mode of associating things, building a memory, and using those memories is very, very common throughout the living world. Also, this kind of Hebbian learning is a sort of good basic model for cognition. So that's what we're sort of looking for. Can we see this kind of behavior in non-living systems? And the system that we were interested in implementing this in is one that already exhibits a range of adaptive behaviors, and it's called the Gray-Scott reaction-diffusion system. It's a very simple, nonlinear, autocatalytic reaction system. It just involves this one reaction where you have two molecules of B and one molecule of A, just converts to 3 molecules of B. So basically B is catalytic on itself. And in order to keep the system out of equilibrium, you pump in a supply of A and you extract B at a certain rate. And the exact details are given here. These are the equations of motion. So this reaction between one molecule of A and 2 molecules of B is represented by this loss term for the concentration of A. And then this supply term here, which is sensitive to the concentration of A and acts to push it back towards unit concentration, and it's parameterized by this parameter F. And then, of course, we've got spatial diffusion of A parameterized by this diffusion coefficient. And for B, it's very similar. We just have an extra parameter in this term to do with the extraction of B. So we're assuming that the extraction of B is greater than the influx of F by this parameter K, and everything else is kind of similar. And so what happens when you actually model this system in 2 dimensions? Well, in general, there are a range of trivial states where you get no pattern formation. So for example, when the reaction is high, is really high, and the feed rate is quite high, you just get this homogeneous region. Likewise, when the reaction grinds to a halt. So for example, if the extraction of B is too high, then and the concentration of B drops too low, then you get this trivial state. But there's this sort of bifurcation in between these 2 trivial states where there's a sort of approximate balance of the 2 parameters, which leads to a balancing of the competing forces of reaction and diffusion, and allows the dynamically stable patterns to form of a range of different morphologies, like waves, sort of traveling waves, spiral waves, lamella structures. And the combination of parameter values that we're interested in is the one in this region of phase space, which produces, there we go, and you've seen this before, produces self-replicating spot patterns. So this is the behavior of the Gray-Scott system at the parameter values that we use here. And so then the question is it possible for those systems to exhibit associative learning? And in general, what we found when we were exploring different permutations of systems that could do learning is that you have sort of broadly speaking 4 different options in terms of constructing your reaction network. And we're basically assuming that in general, there are 2 different environments. One environment where there's no association between this precursor molecule I and this toxic compound T, and then another environment where these 2 things are associated. And so learning this association is potentially an advantage because you can prepare yourself for the arrival of T and defend yourself. So there's this dangerous environment and this kind of non-dangerous environment. And of course, if there's no learning, then in the dangerous environment, the system dies. And in general, if you just respond to the presence of the dangerous compound directly, we basically put a cap on the synthesis rate of this antidote that the system can use to defend itself. When you put that upper limit on the synthesis of that antidote rate, it turns out that just directly responding to the toxic compound is insufficient for the system to defend itself. And then we have this other system which just uses the precursor I as a sort of indicator, which of course works for the toxic environment because it prepares itself, produces antidote, and it's fine. But then we also assume that the antidote itself comes at a cost, either a metabolic cost or that it's slightly toxic. And when you implement that, you find that this preemptive network does not survive well in the safe environment. And in fact, the only system that actually can survive in a system like this is one which does associative learning. And I'll go into more detail now. So the way that we found to sort of solve this associative learning problem with a set of reactions was inspired by this work of McGregor et al. 2012, and basically uses a couple of memory compounds, one short-term and one long-term. So again, we're looking for a system which encodes a correlation between this precursor S and toxin T, because toxin T is going to destroy our system. And so what we do is we just assume that this short-term memory can be synthesized from the presence of S. And then when that short-term memory is also associated with the toxin T, then the system builds up a long-term memory. So this long-term memory is basically performing an AND operation on the presence of S and T. And then once long-term memory has been built up, we assume that, so the system is represented by this compound B, but when there is long-term memory, the system is present, and the precursor compound S is also sensed, then the system produces antidote. And what that means is that because S in this environment is an indicator that T is going to come soon, the system builds up this antidote N, and when T arrives, the antidote neutralizes it, and the system then doesn't get destroyed, basically. So it's really that sort of preemptive preparation of this defensive mechanism, which is key to the associative system defeating or being more functional than the others. And so what that looks like in practice, like I say, when we have this direct network, which basically just produces antidote when it detects the toxin T. And because of this limit on the rate at which it can produce the antidote, what happens is, as we introduce the toxin here, is increasing up to from low to high concentration. And you can see it comes in these bursts that are called boluses. So the system has this sort of natural frequency of events. So this system, as the toxin comes in, the system itself starts to get damaged, and it does produce antidote because it's sensitive to T. But basically, because antidote production depends on the level of B, and because the rate of toxin influx is increasing, it just cannot produce enough antidote to prevent this sort of downward decline of the size of the system represented by B. So this one dies. And then what happens if the system produces antidote in response to S instead of T. Well, then, of course, you get a lot of antidote production, because as soon as you get the first bolus of stimulus, system starts making antidote. And this antidote is then more than enough to compensate for the damage that the toxin causes as it comes in. But then, of course, as the toxin declines, the antidote production keeps going, but it's not neutralized because there's no toxin for it to neutralize. And so antidote level keeps rising and rising, stimulated by these boluses of stimulus, but there's no toxin anymore. So that's why this is not getting consumed. And the antidote N, as I said, comes at a metabolic cost. It actually damages the system. So the population, the size of the system stays here henceforth afterwards, and never actually recovers to its previous level. And then, of course, in the associative learning case, both of these environments are dealt with adequately. So basically, as the toxin comes in, the system does get damaged, but the long-term memory builds up. The long-term memory represents the strength of the association between the stimulus and toxin. So it builds up and builds up. That then catalyzes the production of antidote. And as you can see, the antidote sort of comes in a, like, before the arrival of these boluses of toxin. And so the antidote is basically ready to react with and neutralize the toxin when it comes in. And that is the essential sort of function. So it's using this memory to prepare itself each time when the toxin is about to arrive. And that means that when toxin does arrive, it reacts with the antidote, which neutralizes it and then goes down very quickly. And that means that the system itself does not get damaged. And then as the toxin boluses go down, and the association between precursor and toxin also goes down, long-term memory starts to subside. And that also means that antidote production goes down. And so the population at the size of our system recovers back to where it was before. So that's the way in which associative learning is the most functional strategy in this particular type of environment. And what we find, in fact, is that the long-term memory is basically a sort of time-delayed low-pass filter of what we call the environment parameter E. So that E is just, or epsilon is just the association between S and T. So long-term memory is basically just tracking that with a slight delay. And then what happens if we implement it in the Gray-Scott reaction-diffusion system? Because what I talked about previously was all in a well-stirred sort of zero-dimensional system. So in the Gray-Scott system, we could either deliver everything uniformly across, or we could deliver it at the boundary. It turns out in both cases, the results are very, very similar. So if we look here, for example, these first cases are with no network. So this is just the plain original Gray-Scott reaction-diffusion system, but just where we start introducing toxin around 2000 time steps. And that, of course, damages the spots and they die. Our system dies. When we have the direct network, the spots themselves are sensitive to the toxin. They produce antidote when they detect toxin, but due to this limit on the rate that they can synthesize it and the damage that happens to the spots, because you need spots plus this the detection of toxin to produce antidote, the system basically can't keep up, and the spots again die. In the case of the preemptive network, again, we bring in the toxin and precursor around 2000 time steps. So actually what happens in this case is the system produces loads of antidote once it starts receiving precursor compound, which actually damages the spots. So this is sort of like an overcompensation, which is actually detrimental to the system. And then because the system is actually damaged by antidote, when the toxin starts to really build up, it does get neutralized to a certain extent by the antidote, but by an insufficient amount. And so the spots at this stage are suffering because of the toxin, and they can't ramp up their antidote production because there's not enough of them. And so these things combined mean the system then also dies. But then finally, in the case of the associative learning network, as the toxin comes in with the precursor, the system responds by building up long-term memory and antidote, and the antidote level is sort of proportional to the threat level. But the system does suffer. It's not like it's not perturbed at all. You see here, the population is declining. The decline of the population makes it difficult for the spots to produce enough antidote. So actually here, the population is really suffering, as is antidote production. But the antidote is still neutralizing some toxin, and at this stage, the toxin level is actually ramping down. And so actually the population just about makes it through. So number of spots goes down significantly, but it's able to just about hang on with a bit of antidote production. And then once the toxin is gone completely, it can really recover, and it just goes back to its original population, and it repopulates the space that it previously lost. Yeah, there's a video of all of these models, but that's for another day. So now we're sort of looking into all kinds of interesting developments. So we're going to be, we found a way to basically have the system learn multiple environmental variables, and also we have a way that it can basically not start with the associations between the antidotes and the toxins. So the new system is going to have multiple toxins and antidotes, but it also won't have any like pre-knowledge of which is associated with which. So now it's going to learn environmental associations, and it's going to learn which things are damaging and in which combinations. We're also going to be looking at how it responds when you bring in compounds and reactions not related to the learning. We're looking at other sort of heritable switches in the reaction diffusion spots. So things that individual reaction diffusion spots can basically pass to its progeny. We're also implementing this in the lab. So I have collaborators in Italy who are experts in droplet and protocell systems, Dr. Sylvia Holler and Dr. Richard Loeffler and Professor Martin Hangsig. And together we're basically we're trying to implement this learning behavior in these oil droplet systems. So that is also very cool. And just before we leave chemical learning, I just want to acknowledge my collaborator for a lot of this for the computational part of this work, David Louapre, who's an incredibly talented game designer, software engineer, scientist, and science communicator. Please check out his YouTube channel. It's one of the most popular French language science YouTube channels there is. And it's been a great collaboration, and I'm very blessed that we ended up working together, and I'm really excited for the next steps. So how are we doing on time? Okay, so this is the final part of my talk today, and it's related to trying to detect life as we don't know it, out there in the universe. If we're not looking for exact molecular signatures of life as we see it here on Earth, then what should we look for, basically? How could we possibly detect life? And the simple answer that I'm going to present to you is that we should look for planetary complexity. And I'm going to explain all of the details. So when we do look at exoplanets, in the ideal case, we would see something like this. So this is one of the TRAPPIST planets. We would see it in all its glorious detail. We might see clouds, we might see oceans, we might see land, we might see life. But that is a little way off. We're making great progress with all these space telescopes, but we're still some way from getting sort of full image resolution, full spectroscopic resolution. So in fact, when we look at these distant exoplanets, for the time being, we don't see all this lovely detail. We actually see like a homogeneous sphere, because we can't resolve all those spatial details just yet. But then, of course, because that exoplanet is rotating, moving around its host star, etc., that homogeneous sphere of color, let's say, radiation, changes over time. So So there's time variability of this non-resolved image, so this single pixel image. And in previous work by Professor Jonathan Jiang at JPL and then graduate student Sitong Fan, now postdoc in Paris, their previous work showed that just from that non-spatial time-varying exoplanet data, you can extract properties like the orbital period, the rotation period, the land fraction, ocean fraction, etc. So in fact, just that time-varying light reflectance signal, and we're assuming we have access to multiple wavelengths, that helps. Just from those time variabilities, you can actually deduce a range of planetary properties, at least for Earth, and we're working on Jupiter and other planets as we speak. So that was done with data from the Deep Space Climate Observatory for Earth, and like I say, we're extending it to other planets. And the question really now is, can we detect, for example, vegetation? That's something else that we're working on in the group. And can we detect life? What could we do with those time series of light reflectance to potentially detect life? And our general suggestion here is that maybe we can use the complexity of those signals as an agnostic suggestive indicator for whether or not there's life or not. So this is just an idea. And so then the question is, how do we measure complexity? And the measurement of complexity has a long history. It's not easy. There's no consensus. For a long time, or at least for computer scientists, the conventional method is to use Kolmogorov complexity, which is basically the size of the minimum program that you would need to put into a Turing machine to reproduce your data. But of course, that unfortunately doesn't work with ensembles. And so it essentially just measures the degree of randomness or the lack of compressibility. And so it will characterize noise as data. So that doesn't really work for our purposes, because we would consider a purely random string to be non-complex. So a purely deterministic string is also not complex, but we would assume something that is difficult to describe but has some level of compression would be complex. So it's not extremely high entropy, it's not extremely low entropy, it somehow combines both predictable, compressible, and also random elements. So that's really the challenge for measuring complexity, is how do you capture both of those? And in fact, we chose this framework of computational mechanics, which instead tries to build the simplest possible finite state machine model for your input data, and then calculates the Shannon information content of the state space of that model and uses that as the measurement of complexity, which I'll go into a little bit more detail here. So if you want more information on this technique, I recommend this fantastic paper that was written in 2012 by Professor Jim Crutchfield in Nature Physics. And he's been sort of leading the development of this technique for, well, since the 1980s. So I recommend consulting his papers. But the way that this complexity measurement works is basically you assume you've got your system with many degrees of freedom. You have access to some subset of those degrees of freedom through your measurement apparatus. Through those measurements, you have some time series of values, which in the simplest case would just be a set of bits. And then basically you input this data into an algorithm that performs what's called epsilon machine reconstruction. I can't really go into the details of epsilon machine reconstruction, but it's basically a well-defined algorithm for generating the most compact, maximally predictive equivalent finite state machine representation of something that can generate statistically equivalent data to your input, basically. Once you have that epsilon machine, you can then look at its properties and use those properties as a proxy for the complexity of whatever physics generated your data in the first place. And the two metrics that we're interested in are the entropy rate, which is basically the state probability weighted entropy of the transitions between the states in your epsilon machine, given by this equation. But it basically represents how much randomness there is in the behavior of your epsilon machine. So how unpredictable is it when it's going from one state to the next? And then the other crucial metric that we're interested in is the statistical complexity shown here, which is just the Shannon information content of the state space of the epsilon machine. So you're basically looking at the probability distribution of the different states of your epsilon machine, and then taking the Shannon entropy of that distribution. So for example, if there are a lot of states and it spends a lot of time, it spends a little bit of time in many of those states or all of those states, then this metric is going to be high. Whereas if it has a small number of states, or if it spends the vast majority of its time in a small number of its states, then the statistical complexity is going to be low. And just to give a couple of examples, again, these are taken from Professor Crutchfield's Nature Physics paper. If you had an unfair coin that had heads on both sides, your epsilon machine for that system would be a single start state and a single general state with a single transition, and that transition emits an equivalent measurement symbol of heads every time. So that system has 0 entropy rate because it's fully deterministic, and it has 0 complexity because it has only a single state. So there's the epsilon machine doesn't contain any information. If it was an actual coin, this version, this epsilon machine then changes somewhat, because now every time you flip the coin, obviously there are 2 possible outcomes. One is heads, one is tails, 50-50 each one. But then this system is memoryless. So after that event, it returns to the same state it was at the beginning. So here we have an entropy rate of 1 bit per symbol, because you have because it's uncertain which of these transitions you go into. So there's 1 bit of entropy generated every time, but it doesn't have any memory because each coin flip is independent. So there's only a single state, and hence the statistical complexity is 0. The information content of the state space is 0. And then finally, this last version is where you flip a coin at the beginning, and then you just turn it over at each instance of discrete time. So you start off in this beginning state here, and with 50-50 probability, you emit the symbol heads or tails and go into either state A or B respectively. And then henceforth after that, you just turn the coin over. So then you would go from heads to tails, from tails to heads, and so forth. And this system is fully deterministic. You know what's going to happen. And so in the long time limit, there's no randomness in this system. It's fully deterministic. So the entropy rate is 0, but it does have a statistical complexity of 1 bit, because the system spends half its time in state A and half its time in state B. So this does have at least 1 bit of statistical complexity. So that's probably the simplest possible examples. How do we then apply that to Earth? How do we apply that to exoplanets, of which Earth is a nice example? And just bear in mind that our hypotheses here are that there's a correlation between complexity and the presence of life. And so that would imply that Earth's complexity should be higher than other bodies in the solar system, and that there's a correlation between life and complexity. But of course, just finding that Earth's complexity is high doesn't mean that life should always be associated with complexity. I mean, we have our preconception that Earth's biosphere is a cause of Earth's observable high complexity, but it's also possible that actually the Earth's complexity is not caused by life, and that the presence of life is actually coincidental to the Earth's complexity. And so, you know, as time goes on, we have to try and rule out one of these causal possibilities. So how do we do this kind of complexity analysis for Earth? Well, we take images from the Deep Space Climate Observatory, which was basically taking pictures every hour or so of the Earth in 10 different wavelengths. And then this work, which is presented in this paper and done primarily by Li Shanggu at Peking University, what she was able to do is take each of these discover images, extract characteristic spectral types for different surface types, and then go back to those images and recompose them with ideal spectra for those different surface types. So it basically means that you can recompose these Earth images in whatever combinations of surface types you want. So for example, let's imagine you want, and here we're looking at the reflectance in 780 nanometers. Let's say if you just take away the clouds, for example, the image looks like this. If you replace all of the land surface with desert, but you leave the clouds as it was, the image looks like this. And likewise, you can replace land surface with vegetation or ocean, take the clouds in, put the clouds in, take them out, whatever combination you want. And you end up with different permutations of these surface types. And then what the time series of reflectances in different wavelengths actually look like. So for the original time series with no alterations, they look like this. And we then have to normalize and discretize to go into our complexity analysis. Whereas if, for example, you have no clouds and all the surface is just desert, then these time series become almost featureless with much lower variability. And so when we apply our complexity measurement approach and extract the both the Shannon entropy of the time series and the statistical complexities of the epsilon machines for these time series, we end up with this this summary graph here on the so these data points are existing on this entropy versus complexity plane. And if we just, to orient ourselves, we can start up here. So the highest value of complexity and entropy is exhibited by the original Earth images where we didn't make any alterations. And then what we find in order of decreasing both entropy and complexity, we have these two versions where you still have clouds and you still have multiple surface types, but we've simplified the surfaces a little bit. We've just homogenized to either all desert or all vegetation. But then, and then if we, here we have, for example, desert and ocean, or vegetation and ocean. But when we then go down to a single surface type, so for example, where we just have just ocean across the whole surface plus clouds, or just vegetation plus clouds, we have these three so-called cloudy monosurface worlds, and the complexity and entropy values are slightly lower. If we then just remove the clouds completely, but we leave multiple surfaces on the planet, we end up with this group of slightly lower entropy and complexity values. And then the very simplest of all, the lowest complexity and entropy values, very low levels of features in these time series, is when, of course, we have no clouds and we have a single surface type, and there's very little variability. So this I think illustrates that there is some utility to looking at the complexity and the Shannon entropy of these exoplanet time series. And they can tell us something about the complexity of the features of those planets. This, of course, was done for different versions of Earth. What happens if we apply it to another planet? And Jupiter is a good candidate because Jupiter looks pretty complex from the outside, has interesting cloud systems, distributive structures, the Great Red Spot and vortices and so forth. So, you know, how does Earth measure up to Jupiter in terms of complexity? And Zhao Zheng from our group was able to extract these time series from Cassini data. And I've given one example. We had 3 different wavelengths that we were able to use. And this is one example of Jupiter above, Earth down here, where we've normalized the reflectance. And the whole, the technique that we used is all described in the paper. So what happens when we measure the complexity? And what I'm showing here is in this axis are the wavelengths. So we've got 3 different wavelength time series that we used. And for each of those wavelengths, we can vary this, this parameter K that's related to the way that the epsilon machines are generated. And when you vary this K parameter, the statistical complexity changes. And what this graph is basically showing is that for all 3 of these wavelengths, even over the entire range of K values, we find that Earth's complexity, both the maximum complexity and the average, is higher than Jupiter's for all 3 of these wavelengths. And if we just take an average over those K values again, we see that for the 3 different wavelengths, the entropy values and the complexity values are higher for Earth than they are for Jupiter. So that's reassuring.